Throughout my life, I have worked as a nurse in several hospitals. Before joining the hospital where I currently work, I worked in a geriatric hospital, which is basically a hospital for the elderly, and which was 20 minutes from my house. At that time, I already had some experience with caring for the elderly, so it wasn't new to me. It had only been a few weeks since I knew at the time that this would be my second to last shift. I was working the early morning shift and hadn't slept for almost 24 hours. I had been assigned to the Alzheimer's ward, and the patients on that ward adored me. My young presence certainly brought joy to the people who lived there. I was a young, lively woman in her early 20s, among elderly patients, who, for the most part, were left alone to wander in their own minds. When you are left alone, you may mentally go to other places, but when someone enters your physical space, you may be brought back to that moment in reality. I was that person who often brought patients back to the present. That night, I was dealing with several patients, but a certain patient was more agitated than usual. Her name was Beatrice, and that was my first night dealing with her. Every time I walked into her room, she kept telling me about the voices she was hearing and the man in black she saw in the corner of the room. The other patient who was in the same room spoke to me and asked if I was nearby. But she didn't usually talk much, and she was quite forgetful. My shift had started that night at 9 o'clock, and because of the man in black who was watching her in the corner of the room, to be honest, it was starting to scare me a little. I believed that, in her head, she was actually hearing and seeing these things. So I really felt sorry for her because I imagine it must be pretty scary things for an old lady to see. And even in this complicated situation, I was doing my best, trying to get her to calm down so she could finally fall asleep. I didn't want to turn on the television to try to calm her down, out of respect for someone else who was sleeping in that same room. I held Beatrice's hand and told her that everything would be fine and that she had to take a deep breath and relax. I kept reminding her that she wasn't alone and that I would always be there, and told her that if she needed me, she just needed to call me. This seemed to work, as Beatrice finally relaxed for a moment, and the next time I entered the room, she was finally asleep. The night began to slow down, and time seemed to almost stand still. About an hour later, I was in the hospital's laundry room, where the bed linen is kept, and what's more, the door was closed, so it was very strange that I heard a noise at that time. I turned around, saw nothing, and continued reaching for the sheets. Then I felt what felt like a hand grabbing my shoulder. There was no one in that room. But even so, I knew I had felt something large grab my shoulder. I poked my head out of the room to look down the hallway. There were no other nurses around. Total silence. I had no other option but to ignore what had happened. I went back, finished getting the sheets, and put them in my cart. As soon as I finished, I turned towards the door and was ready to leave that room. I fell to the ground and started screaming while my heart was almost coming out of my throat. There was a man in black standing on the other side of the door, watching me through the glass, smiling. My screams were loud enough to wake up every patient in that ward. The man in black disappeared from my sight, and seconds later, the door opened, and one of my fellow nurses entered the room and began to lift me off the floor as I was completely hysterical. I asked if she had seen a man dressed in black, and her answer was, "What man? There's no one else here." We checked every room in that wing and there was no one dressed in black. My screams woke Beatrice, who was probably in a light sleep. When I entered her room, she started telling me about the voices that this time were screams, but she didn't know that the screams were mine. I asked her what that man in black looked like that she had seen in the corner of the room and asked if he had a smile on her face. She looked directly at me and made a completely focused, completely serious facial expression. She asked me how I knew about the smile, and even though my heart was already beating fast, I felt him speed up even more as soon as she asked me that. Beatrice then started screaming and asking to get out of there, saying that the man was coming to get her. The other nurses entered the room and tried to calm her down. I was switched to another wing of the hospital that night, and eventually I ended up going home early because I just couldn't recover from the scare I had gotten. I texted the head nurse the next day, saying my next shift would be my last. I explained that I was traumatized by what had happened and said I didn't want to go back to that building. Fortunately, the head nurse's response was completely friendly and understandable. I have never been diagnosed with any mental illness, and I have never had any problems with hallucinations. I'm aware that lack of sleep can cause some undesirable effects, perhaps even hallucinations, but what happened that night was another level. I don't know if my tired mind had invented that vision, especially because of the things Beatrice had said in my ear all night. That feeling of the hand grabbing my shoulder. The fact that the smiling man I saw behind that door perfectly matches the description Beatrice had spoken. All of this bothers me to this day. This was one of those once-in-a-lifetime paranormal experiences. At least I hope it's just once in a lifetime.